Hello. So in this episode of Writing Notes, we're going to talk about assessing research sources. So how do you figure out whether or not a source that you found through research is reliable and something that you should be trusting? And in particular, we're going to be using the CARB method. So that's currency, authority, reliability, and bias. 4 things that you want to be thinking about when you're trying to figure out how useful a source is going to be. We're also going to be taking a look at the media bias chart, version 6.0, which is a really useful tool that you'll want to be using if you're looking at research through news or popular sources. So, to get started, we're going to talk about currency, the first of the CARB system. So currency is the question of how recently a source was published. How new is this? And this is something that you do want to be aware of. And we'll talk about why. So most sources, especially scholarly sources, are going to list a publication date. And so you want to be aware of that. So if it's a journal article that you're finding through a library database or something like that, if it's a book, it's going to have a publication date. If it's an article through something like Time Magazine or even a popular source like Rolling Stone, the New York Times, something like this, it's always going to have a publication date. So you want to be checking for that. The other thing that you want to be aware of in terms of the publication date is that some sources are reprinted. We especially find this with books. So for instance, you could have, say, a copy of a book that Sigmund Freud wrote in 1924, but you may have a version that was reprinted in 1991. So the copyright date is going to say 1991, but you want to be aware that that original publication was 1924. So, especially for books, they're typically going to have on the page with the copyright information, they're typically going to have the earliest publication of that particular source. So you want to be aware of that as well. Now, the reason you want to be thinking about currency is that you want to know what people think about a particular topic now. Now, in some disciplines, this is going to be really, really important. So things like science, medicine, technology, you want the most current information possible. As much as you possibly can, you want to see what people are saying about this now, because presumably the most up-to-date information is going to be the most useful. So this is a rough estimation, but I would say for the most part, you want information in these disciplines that's been published within the past 5 years, maybe the past 10 years at most. And if you get back beyond that, so much changes, so much evolves in these disciplines that the information may no longer be current. On the other hand, there's a number of other fields where older information is still fine, where we don't necessarily worry as much about having up-to-date information. So things like English literature, history, philosophy, the arts, theater, these are things where we can have a source that comes to us from 500 BCE that's still considered perfectly reliable. I mean, we can read the philosophy of Plato or of Aristotle. We can read texts from the 1700s, and they may still tell us a lot about the way people think about this particular field. So that's one of the things that you do want to start learning as you become more and more embedded in your own discipline, whatever that is what degree of currency does your field require? The second part of the CARB system is authority, which is about the author's credibility within their specific field. So how much should I trust this particular person, this particular writer? And to be clear here, this can be an individual author, like say Wendy Brown, who's a cultural theorist, sociologist, I think. But this can also be something like a corporate author, like the Cato Institute. So the Cato Institute is a think tank. How much reliability, credibility, authority do they have as a source for research? This is what you're trying to figure out here. Assessing authority can be tricky, and you want to do some outside research about the author in order to figure out more information about them. If you're dealing with an individual author, which is what you're most likely to get with most research, you may look at a university or company profile, something like a faculty profile, especially if this is a person who works in academia. If they teach at a university or something like this, they will probably have a faculty page. You may also look at personal or professional web pages. A lot of academics, a lot of writers, a lot of people who are heavily involved in research and things like this will have their own professional web page. I have my own professional web page, which tells readers a lot about me and about the kind of work that I do. And then professional profiles like LinkedIn may be another source for figuring out who this author is. So what you're looking for, what you're trying to determine when you're looking to these sources are things like where this person works and what they do. So if you are doing research about, say, biomedical engineering and you're interested in the impact of a particular type of tackle in football, for instance. That's American football, by the way. If you're interested in the impact on the brain of a certain type of football tackle, you could figure out what type of work this person does. Are they a biomedical engineer? Do they work someplace reputable? Are they employed as a biomedical engineer? And is their particular field, their particular specialty, concussions or something like that? You can also look into their education. Do they have a solid background suggesting that they have been well trained in this subject? You could look at previous publications, presentations, or other professional activity, because this is going to establish a track record of thinking about this subject, working on this subject, etc., etc. And then slightly more difficult to gauge is going to be the reputation among their peers. So among other people who work on this subject, is this author well respected? Do other people believe that their work is good? And that can be a little more difficult, but if the author has done something like published previous books on the subject, you could try and find reviews of those books or things like this. If they're a professor, you could go to something like ratemyprofessors.com, but that's really assessing them more as teachers from the perspective of their students rather than peers. But those are the kinds of things that you want to try and figure out to determine whether or not this person is an authority within their field. The next thing that you want to figure out, or the next thing you want to assess, is the reliability of this source. So how correct or generally accepted is the information in this source? And this is a little bit difficult to gauge, because if this source is making a unique argument, then not everyone may agree with that argument. So you want to be thinking about the kinds of information you can easily assess. And one challenge that you may run into is that different disciplines have different things that are generally agreed upon. So, for instance, in English, we have, in say, rhetoric and composition, there are certain principles that most people are going to accept as basically true. If you're just starting out in a discipline or in a particular critical conversation within that discipline, you may not have that background yet, and so that may be hard for you to figure out. So some of the things that you can do to help try and determine reliability, one is going to be to distinguish between facts and arguments or opinions. And I've actually done a video on this before, which you should be seeing a link for in the top corner. Because what you can try and do is check the facts in this source against other sources. So if you have a statement of fact, something that can be objectively measured in the world, and other people generally agree on that, that's likely to be a good sign for reliability. Another thing that you can do, and this is going to take a little more time and effort, is to read widely to see what other scholars are saying. Now, I do want to emphasize this because it's actually a really great research practice and something that ideally you should be doing all the time anyway. But if you can read what a bunch of other people are writing about this particular topic, you'll have a better sense of whether or not the research source you found is reliable. Going along with that, you want to develop your own critical sense of the field or the conversation. Again, this is going to take a lot more effort, and this is really something that you develop over years of working in a particular field. So over 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, whatever it is, you may develop a really sophisticated sense of what kinds of arguments are reliable and what aren't. And then the last component of the CARB system is bias, which is about the attitude or position that an author takes. Now, I have my own distinct and very strong feelings about bias, which I'm going to try and keep to a minimum in order to make this more usable for you. But the key thing for me is that when we dismiss an argument as being biased, this isn't necessarily fair to the argument, and it's not necessarily that useful for us as researchers. So the problem that we do want to be aware of is that when an author's bias overwrites reasonable interpretations of the evidence, then the source becomes significantly less useful. So part of the problem is that every source that makes an argument, by virtue of making an argument, it has a bias. Because again, a bias just refers to the attitude or position that an author takes. It's not necessarily a question of truth or falsehood. Where it becomes an issue, as it says right here, is when an author is going to skew or misinterpret information in order to support the argument that they want to make, rather than drawing the most reasonable conclusions based on the data that's available. So this is going to indicate a substantially problematic argument. If you have a source that is ignoring the most reasonable, the most proper interpretation of evidence because they have a particular goal or answer or outcome that they want, regardless of that evidence, then you have a problem with that source. But the thing that you need to know in terms of bias is not how to find sources without bias. What you need to be aware of is what a source's bias is, and that's going to let you read that source critically. So if, for instance, you were reading an article by Milton Friedman, Milton Friedman is one of the key thinkers of neoliberal economics, and so he has a particular bias. There's a particular worldview that he brings to any particular problem, and you can find that bias, you can find that perspective in almost all of his writings. The same thing if you have someone who is deeply ingrained in the Marxist philosophical tradition, if you have someone who's deeply ingrained in the feminist philosophical tradition, if you have someone who is far right, reactionary, conservative, these kinds of things are going to color the way that they interpret evidence, and are going to color the arguments that they make. And what you as a researcher want to do is not necessarily avoid those. Although if you can avoid something like that, it's not a terrible thing to do so. But you want to be aware of that bias so that you can say to your readers and for your interpretation, okay, here are the reasons this may not be, that here are the reasons why the answer may not quite be what this author says. To help with this, you have this great tool that I absolutely love, and a lot of other composition instructors, rhetoric instructors, writing instructors love this tool as well. It's called the Media Bias Chart by Ad Fontes Media. Now, the Media Bias Chart essentially assesses popular news sources on two different scales. So one is reliability, from the least reliable sources down here at the bottom, like News, Punch, Wonkette, Palmer Report, WND, up to the most reliable sources at the top of the scale, the Associated Press, Reuters, Weather Channel, NPR, Bloomsburg is up here. These sources are going to be the most accurate, and they're going to give you the most fact-based information, particularly the most original fact reporting. So if you can find information in something like the Associated Press or Reuters, it's almost certain to be correct. It's almost certain to be factually accurate. And this extends as well for everything in this sort of green bubble here. Generally speaking, these are going to be the most reliable sources. Toward the middle here, you've got mixed reliability sources, and I'm going to come back to that because that's a really important point. But then the other assessment criteria we have is political position. So the sources that are toward the middle here are going to tend to be reliable. They're going to tend to be the most politically balanced. Whereas as you move to this side with things like Occupy Democrats, Alternet, Counterpunch, things like this, these are going to be much more left-leaning. Similarly, things like Judicial Watch, Breitbart, Federalist, Daily Caller, Fox News, these are going to be far-right sources. So you want to be aware of those biases because those are going to shape the types of arguments that these publications are making. And similarly, this question of reliability, from most reliable, mixed reliability, somewhat reliable, unreliable, this works both on the facts and nonsense, facts and lies scale, but also it's linked to the political scale. This is why we have this very distinct sort of inverted V shape. Because as something becomes more politically partisan, it's typically going to become less fact-based. So this is something you want to be aware of. Now, the question I do want to come back to is how you deal with all of these things, especially these ones. So we'll leave out things like Salon, Jacobin, CNN, Washington Times, Epoch Times. Things that are here in the sort of middle ground, have political slant, whatever it is. I want to focus especially on these things that are both in the green, most reliable box, but also in this yellow mixed reliability box. So things like The Hill, The Economist, CNN, The Guardian, Bloomberg. What do we make of that? How can they both be the most reliable and mixed reliability? Well, part of that is because almost all of these sources, if not all of these sources, publish not only news, but opinion editorials. And so that's the thing you want to be aware of as you're assessing a source, as you're assessing a particular piece of information based on where it comes from. So you may find, so if it's a news article in The Economist or in Vox or Bloomberg or whatever it is, that news article may be factual reporting and it may be extremely reliable, but these sources are also publishing op-eds. And with op-eds, you can't necessarily count on the reliability of the newspaper or the magazine or the channel or whatever it is to ensure that that's fact-based, to ensure that that's politically neutral, whatever it is. With op-eds, you often get non-factual arguments from people with a political axe to grind or a political goal. And so you want to, at that point, be thinking about the authority of the author. You want to be thinking about who wrote this, what's their reputation, what are their perspectives, do they have a political bias, and you want to bring that information to an op-ed even in reliable news sources. Okay, so for the media bias chart, this is a link to their website. You will probably not be able to access that through the video, but I'm going to put that in the description down below the video. And if you want the JPEG image version of the media bias chart, which I personally find much easier to use, I will put a link to that in the description as well.